It was a typical morning in the small town. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow across the streets. The local fire department was already bustling with activity. The firefighters moved quickly, preparing their trucks, checking equipment, and getting ready for whatever the day might bring. Among them was Jake, a firefighter who had been with the department for years. He was calm, reliable, and always ready for action. But recently, things had been a little tense at the station, especially when it came to the police department. Jake and the local police didn't always see eye to eye. There had been a few disagreements over the years about how emergencies were handled and who was in charge when things got messy. Some of the cops were friendly, but there was one officer, Officer Tony, who had a reputation for being difficult. He was always looking for a fight, especially when it came to working with the fire department. Jake had learned to avoid him whenever possible. He wasn't looking for trouble, but Tony seemed to find it no matter what. The tension had been building for months, and the last time they had crossed paths, things had nearly boiled over. Jake hoped today wouldn't be like that. Meanwhile, Tony was on his usual morning patrol, driving through the quiet streets in his police car. He was just finishing his coffee when his radio crackled to life. It was a call from dispatch. Fire reported at 44 Oak Street. Possible structure fire. Fire department is already en route. Tony glanced at the address, and his stomach dropped. That was the house of the police chief, a man who had always been tough on his officers. Tony had always felt that the chief was unfair, but today wasn't the time for those thoughts. His priority was the fire. Without a second thought, he sped toward Oak Street, his sirens blaring as he rushed to the scene. He thought he might get there before the fire trucks and help control the situation, or at least coordinate with the firefighters. But there was a twist. He wasn't aware that the fire was much worse than he imagined. As he pulled up to the scene, Tony saw the flashing lights of the fire trucks. They had already arrived. The firefighters were unloading hoses and preparing to battle the flames. Jake was one of the first to notice Tony's arrival. Despite their past disagreements, he gave Tony a quick nod of acknowledgement. But Tony wasn't in the mood for small talk. He was frustrated. He had always thought the fire department was too slow, too careful. He believed they were always waiting for the right moment to act, and that frustrated him. It didn't help that the chief was always on his back about being more proactive. Jake started walking toward the burning house, ready to help with the rescue. But Tony wasn't ready to let him do it alone. He marched over to Jake, his face red with anger. "Why are you just standing there?" Tony snapped, his voice loud. "The fire's out of control. What are you waiting for?" Jake, taken aback by the sudden outburst, stood up straight. He didn't respond right away, trying to stay calm. He knew that Tony had a short fuse, but he didn't want to make things worse. "I'm just making sure we're prepared," Jake replied calmly, his voice steady. He knew the fire wasn't easy to control, and rushing in without the right equipment could make things worse. But Tony wasn't having it. "Prepared? You're always preparing. Why don't you just do something for once instead of just standing around?" Jake felt his frustration growing, but he knew the situation was already tense enough. He didn't need to get into a fight with Tony right now, especially with the fire still raging in front of them. But Tony's insults were hard to ignore. The air was thick with smoke, and the fire crackled and popped as the firefighters worked quickly to contain it. Jake grabbed his hose, giving a quick look toward the chief's house, which was now almost fully engulfed in flames. His heart raced, knowing the fire was going to be a tough one to put out. As he moved forward, his thoughts briefly flashed to his earlier encounter with Tony, but he pushed those thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time for that. There was a life-threatening fire to fight. Tony, however, was still standing nearby, arms crossed over his chest. He watched Jake and the other firefighters with a scowl on his face. It was clear that the sight of the fire didn't seem to bother him as much as the way the fire department was handling it. He couldn't understand why they weren't moving faster. In his mind, the situation was urgent, and the firefighters were taking too much time with their preparations. "You guys are always so slow," Tony shouted toward Jake, his voice rising above the sound of the flames. "We're gonna lose everything at this rate." Jake glanced over his shoulder, his patience beginning to wear thin. He knew Tony wasn't trying to help. He was just looking for someone to blame. Still, Jake kept his cool, focusing on his task. "We're being careful," Jake replied, keeping his tone even. "We're saving the house, but rushing in could make things worse." Tony wasn't listening. His anger was clouding his judgment. "You're always careful, Jake, but how many times has that gotten you nowhere?" He took a few steps closer, his frustration building with every word. "You're not even helping. Get to work." The situation was becoming more heated by the second. Jake could feel his face flush with annoyance. He was already under a lot of pressure, but now Tony was making things worse. His hands tightened around the hose, and he tried to push his emotions down. But then Tony took another step forward, his face inches from Jake's. "You don't know what you're doing," Tony yelled, pointing his finger at Jake. "You're just standing around while this place burns to the ground. What are you even good for?" That was the final straw. Jake's patience snapped. Without thinking, he stepped forward and shoved Tony away, the anger he'd been holding back now bubbling to the surface. Tony stumbled back, surprised by the force of the shove. But instead of backing off, he reacted instantly. With a quick move, he swung his fist and punched Jake right in the jaw. The blow caught Jake off guard, knocking him sideways. His hand flew to his face, the sting from the punch sharp and sudden. He was dazed for a moment, but the sound of the fire roaring around him quickly brought him back to reality. The two men stood there, facing each other, tension in the air thicker than the smoke from the fire. Tony looked as if he expected Jake to fight back, but Jake didn't want to escalate things further. He knew this wasn't the time or place to get into a physical altercation. But before he could react, something unexpected happened. The firefighter and the officer's attention was suddenly drawn to the house across the street. Jake's eyes widened as he saw the thick smoke rising from the building. It was clear now. This wasn't just any house. This was the police chief's house. A cold chill ran down Jake's spine. He realized with a shock that this wasn't just another fire. The person who had been yelling at him, accusing him of being too slow, he was yelling right outside the home of someone who could be in danger. Tony froze, his face pale as he stared at the house. For the first time, the weight of the situation hit him. His earlier anger evaporated in an instant. "Is that?" Tony began, his voice trailing off. Jake nodded grimly. "Yeah, it's the chief's house." Jake and Tony stood in stunned silence, staring at the police chief's house as the flames roared higher. The reality of the situation finally sank in. The fire wasn't just any emergency. It was personal. The house that was being consumed by the fire belonged to the very man who had been the target of Tony's frustration just moments ago. Tony's expression changed completely. His anger had turned into shock and disbelief. "What have I done?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. He took a step back, his mind racing. He had just punched a firefighter who was doing his job, trying to save a house that was now at the center of an even bigger crisis. And the worst part was, Tony hadn't even realized it until now. He had no idea the house he had been standing in front of belonged to the police chief. Jake, still recovering from the punch, didn't know how to feel. He could feel the sting in his jaw from where Tony had hit him, but there was something much bigger at play now. The police chief's house was burning, and there was no time for personal grudges. The fire department had a job to do, and Jake couldn't afford to let Tony's actions distract him any longer. "Come on, Tony," Jake said, shaking off his frustration. "We need to focus. The house is going up in flames. The chief's wife could still be inside." Tony snapped back to reality, the guilt in his eyes replaced by determination. He had made a huge mistake, and now he had to help fix it. He wasn't going to stand by and let anything worse happen to the chief's family. Without saying another word, Tony hurried toward the fire trucks. Jake followed closely behind, still holding his hose, but now his thoughts were fully focused on the rescue mission. They were no longer just two men with a history of conflict. They were teammates trying to save someone's home, and maybe even a life. As they approached the house, they could see how bad the fire had gotten. The windows were shattered, and the roof was starting to collapse. The firefighters had already set up a perimeter and started dousing the flames, but there was still so much to do. Jake could see the smoke curling up into the sky, thick and dark, making it harder to breathe and harder to see. "We need to get inside," Jake said to his fellow firefighters, already moving toward the door. "There could be people inside. Stay alert." Tony stood frozen for a moment, guilt still weighing heavy on him. He glanced back at the fire truck and saw the worried faces of the other officers who had arrived. They were watching him closely, unsure of what to do, unsure if they should be worried about him or the fire. But Tony knew what he had to do now. Taking a deep breath, Tony ran up to the group of firefighters, ready to help. He had to make up for his earlier mistake, and this was his chance. "What can I do?" he asked, looking directly at Jake. Jake paused for a moment, considering the offer. The old frustrations between them didn't matter now. "We need to make sure no one's trapped," Jake said, his voice calm but urgent. "Help me check the back of the house." Tony nodded quickly and followed Jake toward the rear of the property. As they moved around the corner of the house, they could hear faint sounds coming from inside. A muffled voice, maybe a cry for help. The fire was closing in on the back of the house, but the thought that someone might still be inside pushed both men forward. "Stay close," Jake instructed, his hand gripping Tony's arm for a moment. "We're going in together." The two men entered the smoke-filled house, their hearts pounding. They were no longer enemies. Right now, they were just two people trying to do the right thing. They had a job to do, and they weren't going to stop until they finished it. The heat from the fire was intense. As soon as Jake and Tony entered the back of the house, the smoke hit them hard. It was thick and dark, making it almost impossible to see anything beyond a few feet in front of them. Every breath felt like they were inhaling ash, but they had no time to waste. The sound of the fire crackling from inside made the situation even more urgent. Jake pushed forward, leading the way. He knew the house's layout well enough to figure out the most likely places where someone could be trapped. His mind was racing, but his focus was clear. The police chief's wife could still be inside. He had to find her, no matter the cost. "Stay close, Tony," Jake said, his voice muffled by the smoke. "We're going in deeper. Keep your head low, and don't breathe too much." Tony nodded, his own fear beginning to settle as his sense of responsibility took over. His earlier frustration with Jake seemed distant now. There was only one goal: get in, find anyone who was still inside, and get them out safely. They made their way carefully through the house, moving slowly but surely. The fire was spreading fast, and the heat was getting worse by the second. The flames seemed to grow stronger, crackling louder as they advanced, licking at the walls and ceiling. Jake knew they had little time. "I'll check the kitchen," Jake shouted as they reached a hallway. The thick smoke was starting to clear a little, but the flames were still dangerously close. Tony didn't hesitate. "I'll go upstairs. You cover the bottom floor." Without another word, they split up. Tony climbed the narrow staircase, feeling the heat searing into him. His hand shook slightly as he gripped the railing, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to get distracted now. The house was in chaos. He had to act quickly. Meanwhile, Jake entered the kitchen. The room was filled with thick black smoke. He could hear the fire roaring just on the other side of the wall. But there was something else. A faint sound, a voice crying out, weak but clear. "Help. Please, someone help me." Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was her. It was the police chief's wife. She was still here. Without wasting a second, Jake sprinted toward the voice, his legs burning as he moved quickly despite the smoke that seemed to grow thicker by the second. "Hang on, Nam," Jake shouted. "I'm coming to get you." He found her, lying against the floor near the back door. Her face was covered with soot, and she was struggling to breathe, but she was alive. Jake knelt beside her, trying to help her to her feet. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "I can barely breathe. The smoke, it's so thick." "Don't worry," Jake reassured her. "We're getting you out. Just hold on." He helped her to her feet, supporting her as they both staggered toward the door. The fire was getting closer, the crackling louder, but they made it to the back door just in time. Jake managed to pull the door open, but before he could move her outside, a loud crash from above startled him. The ceiling above them had collapsed, blocking the way. They were trapped. Jake's heart raced as he glanced around, looking for another way out. The smoke was so thick now that he could barely see. He could feel the heat intensifying with each passing second. They didn't have much time. At that moment, Tony burst back into the room, his eyes wide with panic. "Jake, we have to get out. The fire's spreading too fast." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the room for an escape route. The only option left was the window. He turned back to the woman, his voice calm but urgent. "Ma'am, we have to jump. It's the only way. Can you do it?" She looked terrified, but she nodded. Jake helped her to the window, and with Tony's help, they managed to pull her out. They jumped to the ground below, landing hard but safe. As they stood there, looking up at the burning house, Jake realized just how close they had come to losing everything. The fire department had done their job, but without their quick thinking, things could have been far worse. The sound of the fire continued to roar behind them as Jake, Tony, and the police chief's wife stood in the yard, away from the burning house. The air was thick with smoke, and the heat from the fire felt like it was still pressing against their backs. But despite the chaos around them, they had managed to escape. The police chief's wife was safe, and that was all that mattered now. Tony stood a few feet away, his face pale. He had his hands on his hips, staring at the smoldering remains of the house. He didn't speak at first, but Jake could see the regret in his eyes. He had made a huge mistake earlier when he had punched Jake. Now, seeing the consequences of his anger, he knew that his actions had almost cost someone their life. Jake, still catching his breath, glanced over at Tony. He wasn't angry anymore, but he could tell that Tony was struggling with what had happened. The fire was nearly under control, and the firefighters had begun packing up their equipment. But Tony, who had once been so sure of himself, was now standing in silence. "You didn't know," Jake said, breaking the silence. "It was a mistake. We all get angry sometimes, but you didn't know whose house it was. We were all just doing our jobs." Tony looked at him, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have known. I should have never let my temper get in the way. I can't believe I did that. I hate you, Jake. You were just trying to help." Jake shrugged. "It's in the past now. You don't need to apologize. But you're right. It was a mistake. But what matters now is that we saved her." Tony's face softened as he nodded. "Yeah, we did. But I shouldn't have acted like that. I let my frustration get the best of me. You didn't deserve that." Jake gave a small smile, trying to ease the tension between them. "It's okay. I'm fine. We're both fine." But Tony's gaze remained fixed on the house, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He had always taken pride in being a tough cop, someone who could handle any situation. But today had shown him that things weren't always as simple as they seemed. Sometimes people made mistakes, and the consequences could be huge. He wasn't used to feeling this way, vulnerable and unsure of himself. But in that moment, he realized that the fire, the house, and everything that had happened had changed him. "We got lucky today," Tony said quietly. more to himself than to Jake. That could have been a lot worse. Jake agreed, his voice more serious now. Yeah, we did. But the important thing is that we did our jobs. We both made a difference today. Tony turned to him, finally meeting his eyes. There was something new in his expression, something that hadn't been there before. It was a kind of respect. Thanks, Jake, Tony said, his voice sincere. I know I messed up, but I'm glad we were able to work together. I won't forget this. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. Neither will I. As they stood there, watching the firefighters finish their work and the smoke begin to clear, the two men shared an unspoken understanding. They had both learned something today. It wasn't just about doing their jobs. It was about teamwork, trust, and the responsibility they had to each other and to the people they protected. The police chief's wife was safe. The house could be rebuilt. And most importantly, the two men who had clashed earlier now shared something even more important: respect. The sun had finally begun to set, casting a soft orange glow over the smoldering remains of the police chief's house. The firefighters, exhausted but determined, were packing up their gear. The fire was mostly under control now, but there were still pockets of flames in the rubble. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and the ground was covered with ash. Tony stood by the fire truck, still processing everything that had happened. He couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to losing the police chief's wife, and how his own anger had almost made the situation worse. But as much as he felt the weight of the day, there was no time to dwell on it. The job wasn't done yet. Jake, a firefighter, called out, his voice urgent. We've got another situation. Jake quickly turned, his attention immediately focused. The fire had spread much faster than anyone had expected, and now they were dealing with a new danger. One of the neighboring homes, a small cottage, was beginning to catch fire. It wasn't as large as the police chief's house, but it was close enough that if the fire wasn't stopped soon, it could spread. We've got to get there fast, Jake shouted, running toward the fire truck. Tony's heart raced as he followed Jake, adrenaline kicking in once again. The day had been chaotic, but there was no time to stop now. People's lives were still at risk, and they had a responsibility to protect them. The two men, along with the rest of the fire crew, piled into the truck and sped down the street toward the small cottage. As they pulled up, the flames were already licking at the sides of the building. The house wasn't as fully engulfed as the police chief's had been, but the fire was spreading quickly. Get your gear on, Jake ordered, already preparing to jump into action. Tony didn't hesitate. He grabbed his equipment and followed Jake, ready to do whatever was necessary. The fire was growing stronger by the second, but there was still hope. As they began setting up hoses and water lines, Jake noticed something that made his heart skip a beat: a child's toy, lying abandoned just outside the cottage. Without thinking, Jake ran toward the front door of the house. Stay back, he shouted to Tony. I'll check the inside. We might have someone trapped. Tony tried to stop him, but Jake was already inside, disappearing into the smoke-filled room. Tony hesitated for only a second before following him. He knew better than to argue with Jake. If anyone could handle a dangerous situation like this, it was him. Inside, the smoke was thick, and the heat was almost unbearable. Jake moved quickly, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. He had to be careful. The fire was too close, and one wrong move could lead to disaster. Then, through the smoke, Jake saw something: a small figure, curled up on the floor. His heart stopped for a moment as he realized it was a young girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old. She was unconscious, surrounded by smoke, and in danger of suffocating if she didn't get out. Without hesitation, Jake scooped her up into his arms and turned toward the door. But as he did, the floor beneath him cracked loudly. The fire was moving faster than he had expected, and the building was starting to collapse. Jake. Tony's voice echoed through the smoke. Get out of there, now. Jake didn't need to be told twice. With the girl in his arms, he ran toward the door, narrowly avoiding falling debris. Tony was there to meet him, grabbing the girl from Jake and pulling her into his arms as they both sprinted outside. The moment they were clear of the house, the roof caved in with a loud crash, sending a burst of flames and debris into the air. Tony's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked down at the little girl, still unconscious but safe. "We did it," Jake said, his voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We got her out in time." Tony nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest. They had done it. They had saved another life. It was moments like this that made all the danger and frustration worth it. As they walked away from the burning cottage, the firefighters rushed to put out the last of the flames. Jake and Tony exchanged a look, and for the first time that day, the weight of the situation seemed to lift, even just a little. They had worked together, saved lives, and put aside their differences. Today had been hard, but they had done what mattered most. The fire had been put out, but the damage was done. The police chief's house had been partially destroyed, though it could be rebuilt. The small cottage, thankfully, had been saved, and the little girl was now safely in the hospital, recovering from smoke inhalation. The fire department had worked tirelessly, and the police officers who had been involved were starting to gather at the scene, some of them looking relieved, while others still seemed shaken. As the firefighters packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Jake and Tony stood by the charred remains of the police chief's house, still processing everything that had happened. The tension between them had almost completely melted away. They both knew they had done the right thing, and that was all that mattered now. But there was one person they hadn't seen yet, the police chief. He had been out of town when the fire had started, and the firefighters had done everything they could to protect his property. The chief's return was something everyone had been waiting for. They didn't know what he would say when he found out about the fire, especially since his wife had been trapped inside. Just then, the sound of an approaching car broke the silence. A black sedan pulled up to the edge of the yard, kicking up dust as it came to a stop. The door opened, and out stepped the police chief, his face a mixture of worry and exhaustion. He looked at the house, taking in the damage, then turned to his officers and firefighters, his gaze resting on Tony and Jake. For a moment, there was complete silence. The police chief, a man known for his stern demeanor, stood still, processing the scene. His wife was still recovering in the hospital, but he had seen enough to know how serious the situation was. "Chief, we're sorry," Tony said, stepping forward, his voice filled with guilt. "We did everything we could, but—" The chief raised his hand, stopping Tony mid-sentence. His eyes weren't angry, though. They were tired, but there was something else in them too. Respect. "You did your jobs," the chief said, his voice steady. "You did everything you could to save my wife, and that's what matters. I can't ask for more than that." Tony and Jake exchanged a surprised look. This wasn't what they had expected. They had thought there might be anger, frustration, or blame. Instead, the chief seemed calm, almost relieved. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't gotten her out," the chief continued, his gaze softening as he looked at Jake and Tony. "But I'm grateful. I know I haven't always made it easy for you two to get along, but today, you both showed what really matters, working together." Jake nodded, surprised by the chief's words. He had been expecting an uncomfortable conversation, maybe even some tension, but instead there was understanding. "We were just doing our jobs, sir. We couldn't have done it without each other." The chief smiled slightly. "That's the point, isn't it? You both had your differences, but today you worked as a team. I saw that, and that's something I won't forget." Tony looked down, still feeling the weight of his earlier actions, but hearing the chief's words helped. He had expected some kind of punishment, or at least some harsh words. Instead, the chief had acknowledged the good they had done. "I'm proud of both of you," the chief added, his voice low but sincere. "The house can be rebuilt. The important thing is you saved lives today." My wife is alive, and that's what I'll remember. For the first time that day, Tony let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The tension between him and Jake, and even between him and the chief, seemed to vanish. They had all been through a lot, but in the end, they had come together when it mattered most. As the chief walked toward the house to assess the damage, Jake and Tony stood side by side, the weight of the day lifting off their shoulders. They had saved lives. They had done their best. And they had learned that sometimes it's not about being right or wrong, but about doing what you can to make things better. The next few days after the fire were a blur. The fire department continued its work, helping to restore order, while the police chief and his wife focused on rebuilding their home and their lives. The police chief's wife was recovering well in the hospital, and the damage to the house was already being assessed. Although the fire had caused major destruction, they had been lucky. The house could be rebuilt, and the most important thing, everyone was safe. Jake and Tony found themselves working side by side once again. But this time, things were different. The tension between them had almost completely vanished. After the fire, the awkwardness of their earlier confrontation felt distant, almost like it had never happened. They had learned something important. Working together was the only way to truly get things done. There was no room for old grudges when lives were on the line. As the days passed, Tony made sure to visit the police chief's wife every chance he got. He wanted to make sure she knew how sorry he was for his actions. He hadn't been the perfect cop, and he knew that, but he was trying to make things right. The chief's wife, still recovering in the hospital, was kind and understanding. She told him that it was the fire that mattered now, not what had happened before. Her gratitude was clear, and Tony felt a weight lifted off his chest. But the work wasn't over yet. The chief was busy making arrangements for repairs to the house, and the fire department continued to help with safety measures in the area. The fire had left behind a lot of damage, but the town was strong. It was a community that looked out for each other, no matter the circumstances. Jake spent some time reflecting on the past few days. He thought about how quickly things had escalated, how a simple argument could have turned into something much worse. He realized how easy it was to get lost in frustration and anger. But today, as he walked through the fire-damaged streets and saw the firefighters and officers working together, he knew it had all been worth it. He caught up with Tony one afternoon after a long day of work. The fire was now a memory, but there were still plenty of details to work out. The house repairs, the thank yous, and the community support were all part of the healing process. Jake smiled as he saw Tony standing by the truck, cleaning his gear. "You know," Jake began, "the chief's right. What happened with us wasn't easy, but we got through it. We did our jobs." Tony looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, I guess we did. I just wish I hadn't been so quick to judge. You were just trying to do your job, and I let my temper get the best of me." Jake shrugged. "We all get frustrated sometimes. What matters is how we move forward. And we're moving forward." Tony smiled, a genuine smile that showed the weight of the last few days had lifted. "You're right. And, you know, I've learned a lot about working together. I won't forget that anytime soon." Jake clapped him on the back. "Good to hear. And hey, I think we've earned a break. Once this is all done, how about we grab a drink and talk about something other than fires?" Tony laughed, shaking his head. "I think that sounds like a great idea." As they stood there, looking over the scene of the burned house and the tireless work being done to rebuild, they both knew they had learned something important. They had learned that it wasn't just about doing their jobs well. It was about doing them together, with respect, understanding, and a willingness to put everything aside when it mattered most. In the end, that was what made the difference. The fire had been a wake-up call, not just for Tony and Jake, but for the entire community. It had shown them that no matter the challenges, when people worked together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. And that was a lesson worth remembering. The days after the fire felt like a new beginning for everyone involved. The smoke had cleared, both literally and figuratively, and the community had started to heal. The police chief's house was being rebuilt, and his wife was now fully recovered, back at home and surrounded by the love and support of the people who cared about her. The fire, while devastating, had sparked something in the town, a renewed sense of unity. For Jake and Tony, things were different too. What had started as a fiery confrontation between two men from different worlds had turned into a friendship that neither of them had expected. They had learned something powerful from the fire, about teamwork, about humility, and about putting the past behind them. They no longer saw each other as rivals or opponents. Instead, they saw colleagues, brothers in arms, working for the same goal, to protect the community. Jake had spent some time thinking about how quickly things had changed. One moment, he had been caught in the heat of an argument with Tony, and the next, they were both rushing into a burning building, risking their lives to save someone. It was a reminder of how fragile life was, and how the smallest actions could have big consequences. But it was also a reminder of the strength that people could find when they worked together. Tony, too, had done some reflecting. He had always been quick to judge, always ready to fight for his own way. But after the fire, he realized that there was so much more to being a good cop than just proving he was right. It was about making tough decisions, about admitting when he was wrong, and about putting others before himself. The fire had opened his eyes to a new way of thinking, and he was grateful for it. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, and the rebuilding efforts on the police chief's house were well underway, Jake and Tony found themselves standing side by side again. They were watching the workers as they moved around the yard, making progress on the repairs. It had been a long road, but things were finally starting to look up. "I never thought I'd see the day," Tony said, breaking the silence. "You and me, standing here, getting along." Jake chuckled. "Me neither. But we did it. We came together when it mattered." Tony nodded. "Yeah, we did. And you know what? It feels good." Jake smiled, his gaze still on the house. "It feels good knowing we did our jobs, and that we helped each other out. The chief might have been mad at us before, but now we've earned his respect." Tony laughed. "And I think we've earned each other's respect too." The two men stood there for a moment longer, letting the calmness of the evening settle over them. The fire that had once threatened to tear them apart had instead brought them closer together. The lessons they had learned would stay with them forever, shaping the way they saw each other and the world around them. As the workers finished their day and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jake turned to Tony. "So what now? The fire's out, the house is being rebuilt, and I think we've earned a little rest." Tony grinned. "I'm with you on that. I think we've earned a lot more than just rest, though. How about we take a trip, get away from all this for a while?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "You want to leave? After everything we've been through?" Tony shrugged. "I think it's time for a new chapter, a fresh start." Jake thought about it for a moment. The idea of taking a break, stepping away from the chaos, sounded good. He had been through a lot, and maybe Tony was right. It was time to turn the page and see what else life had to offer. "All right," Jake said, grinning. "Let's do it. A fresh start sounds perfect." As they walked away from the house, ready to leave their past behind and embrace the future, Jake and Tony knew that whatever came next, they were ready. They had each other's backs now, and that made all the difference.